Welcome to the first video in a series of videos on sentence diagram. Sentence diagramming is really just a way to visually represent the way that words function in sentences. So if you watched the part of speech videos, I placed a lot of emphasis on not just the textbook definitions of the words, nouns for example, but how they functioned in the sentence, how they operated in the sentence. Sentence diagramming is all about helping us understand how words function in the context of individual sentences, how they operate. And it's a graphic organizer, a visual map, if you will, of that function. Okay? So let's just start with the very basics. As we've already said in previous videos, every independent clause has a subject and a predicate. Remember, a subject is what the sentence is about, it's the topic, and the predicate tells us about the topic. It answers what about the subject. Okay? When we diagram, we place what I like to call a firewall. A firewall between the subject and the predicate. It's just a line that separates the subject and predicate, okay? Because those are the two basic ingredients in any independent clause, any independent thought, okay? So, what we're going to do first is we're going to draw a horizontal line, and then we're going to draw the firewall separating the two. Let's take a look at the first example. Dogs bark. I'm going to write dogs first, and then I'm going to write bark. Now, we're going to draw a horizontal line across. The subject goes on the left side, and the verb goes on the right side, the predicate. And we're going to draw a firewall between the two. Okay? Now, notice that the firewall extends below the horizontal line. It cuts through the horizontal line like a knife. Okay? You'll see why that's important later. The second one, time is our subject, horizontal line. What does time do? It flies. That's the predicate. Notice I'm including punctuation. It's good practice. The third example, it is our subject. What about it? Well, it rained. Rain is our predicate. Notice again that the firewall, as in the first two examples, is a vertical line that cuts through the horizontal line. It cuts through it, and the horizontal has the subject on the left side and the predicate on the right. Pretty simple. This is the first basic pattern that you need to know in sentence diagram. It is simply subject, firewall, and we're going to write action. Okay? Now, if you take a look at all these examples, barked, flies, rained, they're all actions. And these are certain kinds of actions. We're going to talk about what they are. They're called intransitive verbs. An intransitive verb, whether it's bark, flies, or rain, is just a verb that is not followed by an object. And I'll explain what that is when we take a look at the next example. In other words, intransitive does not transfer the action from the subject to an object. Remember, trans is movement. In is not. So in other words, there's no movement. There's no transfer from the subject to an object. Okay? Intransitive verbs. Let's take a look at the next example. Dogs chase cars. I'm going to clear what I've written. And I'm going to scroll down the page a little more so you can see. Okay? Dogs chase cars. Now, this is done slightly different. Take a look at how it's done. First of all, dogs is our subject. That's what the sentence is about. Here's my firewall. Directly to the right of the firewall is the verb. That's what starts the predicate. What do? They chase. But now, I have another word in the sentence. Cars. Think about what cars is doing in that sentence. Cars are being acted upon, to use the previous terminology, by the dogs. What would I do? I extend the horizontal line a little bit, and I add a next vertical line. You'll note that this vertical line, the second one, is different than the first one, in that it doesn't cut through the horizontal. Remember, there's only one firewall, and that is the wall between the subject and the predicate. See, chase cars is the complete predicate. This is called the complete predicate. If I asked you, what about the dogs, you wouldn't just say they chase, you would say they chase cars. That's what about the dogs. So the complete predicate includes this word cars, all right? This word cars is called a direct object. And it goes after the verb on the diagram. Okay? This line that separates the verb from the direct object, that lets us know it's a direct object. Doesn't cut through the horizontal line because there's only one firewall. There's only one wall that's strong enough to separate the subject and the predicate, and that's the one that cuts through. Okay? Now, we can do the same thing with sentence 5. Jamie what does she do or he? Kicks. What do they kick? Ball. There's a transfer of action from the subject, Jamie, to the ball being kicked. And we're going to put the on a slanted line under ball. And I'll explain that a little bit later in a different video. This is the second sentence pattern. Unlike the first one, it's adding this element of a direct object. Okay? Let's take a look at that, and we'll write down the second pattern. The second pattern is subject, just like in the first, firewall, action verb, because remember, in both of these examples, just like in the first three, chase and kicks, they're both actions. We can both do them, right? They're verbs. But now we have an extra line. Remember, it's not cutting through the horizontal, and we write direct object. And this brings us to the definition of a transitive verb. Now, we had intransitive just a few minutes ago. Remember, intransitive meaning no movement. Now, we have movement. We have a transfer, in other words. We have a transfer of action from the subject doing the action to an object that's receiving that action. So in other words, cars is receiving the action from the dogs are chasing the cars, and the ball is receiving the kick from Jamie. Jamie is kicking the ball. There's a transfer of action from the subject to the direct object, it's called. And a transitive verb is just an action verb followed by a direct object. Unlike an intransitive verb, which is an action verb not followed by a direct object. An action verb that is transitive transfers action to an object. That's it. Okay? So that's our second sentence pattern. Okay? Let's move on to the third. Now, these are funny. Dogs are mammals. Fred is funny. Look at those for a second. Do you see any action? Can you find any action in that sentence? Can you are down the street? Can you is into class? Are and is are not actions, but they are verbs. If you remember from our parts of speech video on verbs, we said verbs can either be actions or, hopefully you remember, states of being. And if you recall, the way we remember those are Mr. Isamar, B, was working. And if that's not familiar to you, go back to the video on verbs. Now, are, here it is an, oops, I forgot the are, and is are in Isamar, okay? So, they're state of being verbs. Watch how I diagram. Dogs is still my subject. Firewall. What about dogs? They are mammals. I'll do the next one. Fred. What about Fred? He is funny. The only difference between these two examples and these from up here is that second line. Notice the second line is no longer vertical. Instead, it's slanted. It's slanted back to the subject, like a backward slash, a backslash. Okay? When you have a state of being verb in a diagram, afterwards, you slant the line because that word that follows it is not a direct object being acted upon. It's what's called a complement. Think about it. It can't be a direct object because a direct object is acted upon, which means you need an action. Well, the mammals aren't being ar'd by the dog. Funny isn't being is'd by Fred in the way that the ball is kicked by Jamie or the cars are chased by dogs. Instead, we have our third sentence pattern, and here it is. It is subject, firewall. Now, this is not an action verb as in the first two patterns. It's what's called a linking verb or state of being verb. We can say either one. Same thing. Slanted line, remember? And we're going to call it a complement. Okay? In other words, it complements the subject. Not as in it's always positive, like Fred is funny. It could be Fred is lazy, right? But it is redefining Fred in some way. It's modifying Fred, giving us more information about Fred. It is complementing Fred in the same way that mammals complements dogs. It gives us more information. Now, complements can be one of two options. They can either be nouns, as in mammals in the first example, or they can be adjectives, adjectives, as in the second example. Okay? So, we call the first one, because it's a noun, mammals, we call it a predicate, that's a nominative. Nomin means name, right? It's renaming dogs as mammals. Or, in the second example, because that's an adjective, we say it's a predicate adjective. So predicates that have state of being verbs are one of two things: predicate nominatives or predicate adjectives. Please study and remember these three sentence patterns. Thank you.